Now we have one of the bravest, one of the pioneers also. We have our very own Sheila Jeffries, one of the founders of our organization WDI, Women's Declaration International, who's going to talk to us about the insult of transgenderism. So Sheila, over to you.
I think we need to move on to the next stage in our struggle against transgenderism. That is moving beyond confronting individual challenges, such as men entering women's spaces, sports, and opportunities, to opposing the idea and practice of transgenderism itself. I'm going to talk today about how the concept and expression of something called gender identity on the part of men who impersonate women is an insult to us. You may wonder what is new about that. So many women now recognize that today, after the great activism and successes of the now worldwide movement for women's sex-based rights. But I do not think that the insult of transgenderism to women is fully realized. There is an inclination on the part of many feminist activists to find an acceptable reason for the exclusion of men with gender identities, such as women's safety, without opposing the very idea of transgenderism. This is completely understandable. It may seem to make sense tactically, since most of the public understands such emergencies as the threat to women if men with gender identities are in women's prisons or masquerading as leaders of the Girl Scouts on overnight trips. The public, we may feel, are not yet ready for understanding why it is a problem that men impersonate women at all. It is also understandable because of a desire for safety against the intense fury and hatred that result if women do speak out. In the UK, after all, the police will arrest women and visit their homes to raid their bookshelves. And as in the case of a woman in the UK recently, who put up stickers saying that men cannot be women, confiscating an academic book critical of the transgendering of children as if it was Mein Kampf, except that they would probably have left Mein Kampf behind. If women mute their fury and concentrate on criticizing specific egregious examples of men's intrusion and threat, rather than the very concept of transgenderism, the idea that men can become women itself, they may escape the most severe forms of punishment. I am hugely impressed by and appreciative of the work of my feminist sisters in defending women's sex-based rights. It worries me, though, to see some feminists who describe themselves as gender critical saying on social media and websites that they are not transphobes and saying that they support something called trans rights. I do understand that these feminists are seeking to protect themselves from the very real fear of being punished. They're probably lying, because I find it hard to believe that they're really in favor of something called trans rights. Trans is an invention, a form of sexual fantasy for the majority of the male hobbyists who adhere to it. Men who play up to gender identity in public are not an oppressed minority in the way that others who are oppressed on the grounds of sex, race, class, and sexuality are. The idea that their identity should be taken seriously and enshrined in law is not just insulting, but detonates a bomb under all the huge amounts of work that feminists and all those concerned with social justice have been doing for decades. I do think that all those involved in feminist activism against the demands of men who impersonate women know all of this. And I shall say more about the dangerous way in which the concept of identity is eroding social justice later. The term gender critical itself, though it may appeal because it is unthreatening, implies that there are just some bits of gender that are problematic and some bits of perhaps that can be saved. Radical feminists, on the other hand, understand that gender, which means sex role stereotypes, needs to be abolished in its entirety. Radical feminists are not critical of gender. We work towards the world where it no longer exists. Gender critical is a polite term used so as not to sound too confrontational. I argue that the very existence of the idea that men can be women, let alone its expression in public, is insulting. This is generally recognized in relation to transracialism and even transableism, in which mostly men seek sexual excitement by pretending to have a disability, but not in relation to the different ways in which men imitate women for sexual excitement or entertainment. It is interesting to consider why the behavior in which members of the ruling class of men imitate and mock members of the subordinate class of women is seen as positive, or at least something that needs to be respected, and to earn its practitioners the status of a rights-bearing category. Similar behavior, after all, in which white people adopt and act out stereotypes of Black people for their own amusement, which is called blackface, is despised and called out by all people who see themselves as right-thinking and progressive. The men and women who imitate other cultures and ethnicities do not pose a threat of physical or sexual violence to women and girls, and their number is small. But their practice, even in just going to a fancy dress party in the costume of an equality category which is not their own, is excoriated. I argue that this distinction is false. I shall talk today about all the forms of what can reasonably be called womanface, the behavior in which men impersonate women. It takes three forms. The majority of the men who impersonate women are what used to be called in sexology, the science of sex, transvestites, i.e. heterosexual men who are sexually excited by acting out what they understand to be women's subordination through clothing, hormones, or surgeries. A minority of female impersonators are all gay men who are unhappy about loving men without pretending to be women. I will also cover another category of gay men, those who perform as drag queens. This is now a serious career path as drag becomes more and more dominant in Western culture, and drag queens appear on TV competitions, on panels and talk shows as celebrities, all through the mockery of women. All of these men are included under the umbrella of transgenderism in the definitions of organizations devoted to what they call transgender rights. All of these men do womanface. Those who are gender critical, but nonetheless respect what they refer to as trans rights, do not define exactly what they respect and what they do not, but there seems to be a dividing line between men simply expressing their gender identity in public space, which is seen as okay, and men's behavior of masquerading as women in order to gain entry to women's protected spaces, toilets, prisons, and refuges, or trying to steal women's opportunities through entering women's sports, or winning women's quotas in politics or women's literary prizes, which is not. But the insult of transgenderism does not stop at practices which have such manifestly harmful effects upon women and children. The expression of gender identity, I argue, is insulting in and of itself. The problem is that men doing womanface are insulting to women when they're just walking down the street or sitting in a cafe, activities for which they need an unwilling audience of women in order to get sexual excitement. But we do not have language to enable us to express the insult and anger we feel every time a man pretending to be a woman intrudes himself into our sightlines. I want to talk today about what kind of language is available to describe the injury we experience. Consider men's role-playing of gender in the workplace. Because the right to gender expression is now commonly recognized in workplaces, it is likely that women have no right to object to their male workmates playing dress up with stereotypes of womanhood at the next desk. Men doing this insulting behavior may be their bosses, and women may have to respect them in meetings. Women's rights go out of the window in such situations. When a man transitions in the office, his female workmates must now refer to him by a woman's name and pronoun. They must suppress their feelings. Indeed, there is no language for their feelings, and they are likely to experience inchoate resentment or anger. Women may even feel that they are the problem if they cannot accept that Jack is now Daisy. I do not imagine that white men will be able to play act being Black in the workplace or indulge their identities as wolves, as those men who are into transspeciesism might like to do. they would not have the right to play act protected in the same way. It's useful to look at the language and concepts used to teach people what is wrong with blackface, to see if this can help to provide a language to describe the injury to women when men play at being women. An article in Vox magazine advising people not to dress up in blackface for Halloween parties provides some useful language. It says, for example, put down the black and brown face paint, step away from the bronzer 12 shades darker than your skin. That is, if you're at all interested in not being a walking symbol of racism this Halloween. The language here is useful. We should be able to say to a man doing womanface, take off the high-heeled shoes if you want to avoid being a walking symbol of sexism. There is a problem with the word sexism, though, because women are seen as having less human status compared with men. The term is often treated as a joke, certainly not taken seriously in the way the term racism is. Woman-hating or misogyny are stronger words. The article argues that blackface contributes to cultural prejudice against Black people rather than being harmless behavior, saying, we have blackface performances to thank for some of the cartoonish, dehumanizing tropes that still manage to make their way into American culture. We should be able to say this about drag, for instance, which mocks women for entertainment in the same way as blackface mocks Black people. We should be able to argue that drag disseminates poisonous prejudice against women into the culture. But drag is currently seen as just wonderful fun and is increasing in ubiquity in Western culture. The Vox article quotes an academic, David Leonard, saying, blackface is never a neutral form of entertainment, but an incredibly loaded site for the production of damaging stereotypes. The same stereotypes that undergird individual and state violence, American racism, and centuries worth of injustice. The same man says that blackface can serve to support implicit bias and discriminatory treatment in areas from law enforcement to employment. All of this could be argued against womanface, that it supports implicit violence and discrimination against women. We are a long way off being able to make such arguments against the influence of drag and transvestism on the status of women. But that, I argue, is where we need to get to. The academic in the article talks of blackface causing harm in terms of eliciting anger or sadness or triggering various emotions, and describes the behavior as the chance to mock, dehumanize, and to dismiss the feelings and demands of others, and that it perpetuates a racist society. All of these are good words that women should be able to use to describe our reactions to men in womanface, because whether in the supermarket or on stage, their behavior dehumanizes us and creates anger and sadness. He says that those who do not understand what is wrong with blackface should be asked what is right about it. He says that fans of blackface should ask themselves, why do I derive pleasure from this? What's the investment in doing it? And what's the investment in defending it? This is a question that is not asked of the transvestites that have gained credibility with some feminists for seeming to support our cause by arguing that men cannot become women. A number of men have become celebrities for feminists because they publicly state their opposition to much of current transgender politics. They're often lauded for that and for their ability to criticize the most outlandish behaviors and claims of transvestites from an insider perspective. I will not name names here, but many of you will know exactly who I mean. These men need to be asked how they dare to continue with this hugely insulting behavior, and they need to desist and apologize. That would be disappointing to them, though, because it would remove the only reason for their celebrity, and they would fade into the woodwork of the male population once more. The unacceptability of blackface is now well understood in popular culture. There is even an article in Good Housekeeping magazine, for instance, on why blackface is wrong, which is also helpful in understanding why womanface is insulting. It says, but the impact of blackface is no laughing matter. The practice depicts Black people as unworthy of human dignity. It's not a stretch to say that caricaturing Black people creates a moral justification for violence. so it should not be taken lightly. Seeing drag as a moral justification for violence, though, is the complete opposite of how it is celebrated now. Arguably, the version of womanface that is drag is closer to blackface than the other main version, transvestism, is, in that drag and blackface are usually practiced as forms of entertainment. Transvestites, on the other hand, role-play women for sexual excitement, and a part of their fetish is being able to do this in the company of and in front of women. They may engage in impersonating women just on weekends or as a more permanent lifestyle choice. There is a form of blackface, however, which is closer to what is now called expression of gender identity. A rather small group of white people do role-play Aboriginality in Australia, or Asian or Afro-Caribbean people in the US. This is unusual behavior, and it's commonly practiced by women as commonly practiced by women as by men, which is in itself interesting and needs to be analysed in the context of the oppression of women. Because whilst for the men it is likely to represent a sexual fetish, for the women the motivation will be different. But this behaviour is usually decisively rejected and seen as reprehensible, as in the case of Rachel Dolezal, a white female academic in the US who pretended to be Black, even to the extent of establishing quite a reputation in the discipline of Black studies. She lost her career and reputation. Transracialism, though, in which men impersonate other ethnicities or cultures for excitement, is usually seen as completely different from transgenderism. And it's interesting to see why that is the case. An article last year in The Conversation, an academic blog platform, by two men, a pro-vice-chancellor and an equity projects officer from Edith Cowan University in West Australia, sternly rejects the idea that there is any similarity whatsoever between blackface and womanface, on the grounds that people who transgender have no choice. It is involuntary, whereas blackface is a choice. This implies that transgenderism is somehow innate. That is not true, of course. Men who engage in transvestite behavior have a choice not to do it. They may feel impelled to do it because they have been so much affected by the transvestite pornography they consume. But that is not the same as having no choice. The example that the article's authors use to illustrate their argument that blackface is entirely different is the UK influencer of Holly London, who has come out as non-binary Korean. London has received considerable criticism, including from Korean critics, who excoriate him for appropriating their culture. The concept of appropriation is frequently used in the critique of men and women impersonating ethnicity. It can be equally well used to describe the insult of men doing womanface, but it is not. Women are not seen as having a culture. He uses precisely the same language and concepts as men with gender identities do to justify his behavior. He says he is transitioning from white to Asian, for instance, and talks of being born in the wrong body. It feels so good to finally come out as a Korean non-binary person after being trapped in the wrong body and wrong culture my whole life. The idea that you can be trapped in the wrong culture as well as a wrong body is a new twist. He has had 18 surgeries to shave his jaw and change his eye shape, costing £250,000. This month, he announced that he was going to reduce the size of his penis because the average size of a Korean penis is smaller than his appendage. He wears feminine clothing and identifies as non-binary, but no appropriation of womanhood is seen in this fact by his observers. He uses they, them pronouns, so does not identify as female, just not male. The academics state that, no, you can't identify as transracial, but you can affirm your gender. At their core, they say, London's words and actions are a prime example of racism, cultural appropriation, and transphobia, enacted from a position of considerable privilege. Trans and gender diverse experiences don't equate with someone deciding to change their appearance to be part of a group, whose experiences, community, and struggles they can't fully understand. Men, they imply, do fully understand the community and struggles of women. Arguably, being able to understand what it is like to have the body and experience of the opposite sex might be even more difficult. So this is a strange distinction to make, but male authors like these cannot be expected to recognize women as fully human. Despite such vehement rejection by critics of the idea that transracialism and transgenderism could be seen as similar, there are some who are prepared to make that argument. Back in 2017, an article was published in the feminist philosophy journal Hypatia, which occasioned huge controversy. Rebecca Tuvell, an assistant professor at a US university, compared the cases of two persons who pretended to be members of an equality category that was not their own. Caitlyn Jenner, the athlete, who in old age started to impersonate a woman, and Rachel Dolezal, who I mentioned above. Tuvell argues that considerations that support transgenderism extend to transracialism. Given this parity, since we should accept transgender individuals' decisions to change sexes, we should also accept transracial individuals' decisions to change races. There was a big campaign on social media to get the journal to retract the article, which split the editorial board. The article stayed up, and Tuvell has now got a tenured position as an associate professor of philosophy at Rhodes College in Memphis. But this clearly demonstrates the dangers that face feminists presently if they wish to make such an argument. Whereas Jenner and Dolezal do womanface and blackface as lifestyle choices, some men do blackface just as part of drag queen performances, that is, just for entertainment and as part of their careers. These people who do blackface do tend, these drag queens, to be criticized. One who has made a good career out of blackface is Chuck Pitt, a gay white male comedian from Canada. He has attracted criticism and cancellation of his performances because of his portrayal of a Black woman in a character called Shirley Q. Licker in a cabaret act for white audiences. There have apparently even been demonstrations against him from Black, gay, and transgender activists, but none yet from feminists, because the mockery of women that is the basis of drag is so normalized that it is invisible. Many forms of mockery of other cultures and ethnicities are acted out by drag queens, and they are controversial, though their impersonation of women is not. In Australia, there are white drag queens who do Aboriginal drag, such as the Australian drag queen Scarlett Adams, and competitor in Drag Race Down Under in 2021. Photos came to light showing that he had performed not only in blackface, but in a burqa, Aboriginal dress, and more. But he suffered no penalty. He apologized, but pointed out that a lot of other drag queens did blackface. The Aboriginal drag queen Felicia Fox objected fiercely to Adams' pretense of being Aboriginal, but had no awareness that women might find mockery of their bodies, culture, and personhood objectionable. Mockery of women is the foundation of drag, but it's only the admixture of race and ethnicity that occasions any complaint. All these men have built careers on the mockery of women. There's no harm to be seen in it, because women are not understood as fully human, not seen as capable of being insulted or offended against. It is hard to understand why transracialism and transgenderism, or even transableism or transspeciesism, are understood so differently when they are all fantasies and for the men involved mainly sexual. There are two possible explanations. One is that women are seen as so unimportant, having no material reality, really just a trope, i.e. a figurative or metaphorical use of a word or expression, so lowly in status, barely human compared with men, that it is of no account if men just treat women as a figment of their imagination. It may even be that women have been so conditioned into accepting that they are less worth than men, that they would consider it ridiculous to suggest that they could be as worthy of respect as Black men should be. The other is that those who think there is a difference believe that though many identities are simply unreal and may be insulting, when men identify as women, this does represent something real. That some essence of gender, even if not biology, makes the men who claim it into some kind of real women. There is a great deal of propaganda from trans rights and gay organizations through school programs and the medical profession to suggest that children and adults who claim to be the opposite sex really do possess some unique qualities that make them different from the ordinary boys and girls and men and women that they really are. And many, even gender-critical feminists, may really believe this, though I find that hard to accept. When they exempt men who pretend to be women from the complete rejection that they would almost certainly extend to transracialists, who are very clearly not possessed of any special qualities at all that make them different from anyone else except active imaginations. I want to finish by talking about the problematic notion of identity. The basis for all the acting out that is done in the name of transracialism, transgenderism, transableism, and transspeciesism is the concept of identity. Identity today mainly means a sexually exciting fantasy in a man's head. It is a very dangerous notion politically because it destroys the meaning and use of categories of oppression in social justice politics, something that took decades in the building and that many feminists and lesbian feminists took part in. There is a history to the term. Back in the 1970s, some feminists adopted the notion of identity in relation to what is now called intersectionality, and then came to be called identity politics. The Black feminists who promoted the term sought to explain that a woman could identify as both female and Black, and her experience would be fundamentally affected by being in possession of two oppression identities which were intertwined. Identity, however, did not mean then what it means today, when it has been emptied of political meaning. Back then, it meant something like class consciousness, i.e. whether a person identified being Black or being a woman, which was a necessary basis for anti-racist and feminist political organization and action. Many who were women or Black or both might not make a political identification, i.e. recognizing how these identities affected their lives and deciding to take action, but being Black and being a woman were understood as material categories based on biology, history, and circumstances. You might not politicize the categories, but whether you did or not, the categories remained materially real. Now, identity means something quite different, something entirely in the mind and with no connection with material reality at all. This changeover from identity being seen as applying to something real to meaning a fantasy took place largely in the 1990s as the move to post-structuralism and queer theory in the universities. Back in the late 90s at the University of Melbourne, where I taught, I was horrified when my subjects were placed in the category of politics of identity, which included psychoanalytic politics. No, I said, being a woman is not an identity, it is biological reality. This was not, of course, understood, and I was just seen as being difficult. The concept of identity as fantasy won out. Today, as we know, the concept of gender identity is being written into law and policy. Equality Acts, which would once have applied to the material categories of race, class, and disability, have now been extended to cover projections of the imagination. This is likely to have an effect on the very concept of equality. If men can claim to be women, why should not white men pretend to be Black? Why should not men with disability fetishes pretend to have disabilities and demand to be accommodated at the workplace for the wheelchairs or other equipment that they do not need, because in fact they have no physical impairments? The determined undermining that of all that we have built as feminists or other campaigners for social justice and equality is taking place. If the fantasy in which men pretend to be women is accepted politically as it is at present, why will the categories of race and disability survive as material realities rather than being just fantasies? The work of decades is being dismantled to service the whims of white, able-bodied men. Presently, we are far from the recognition that transgenderism is an insult to women. Today, our failure to respect men's fantasies in the form of misgendering, for instance, can lead to huge penalties. We are in the position of the peasants who had to tug their forelocks to the lord of the manor. But we should not mute the ambition to see women recognized as full human beings. We must work towards a situation where Good Housekeeping magazine will have an article excoriating Womanface. We have to get there because anything else means forever accepting that women are inferior.
How do we defend gender nonconformity, including wearing the clothes assigned to the other sex? Are we opposed to all cross-dressing, and whether that does not reinforce the idea that women need to wear dresses and makeup as part of our womanhood?
How do we pique people? Well, we're all doing it in all the different ways we do. So I think just hearing how everybody else is doing it is the best thing we can do there. And Isla's been talking about it here. In relation to the second question, I think this is an interesting question because, of course, yes, people should be allowed to wear what they like. The problem is at the moment is that we have a costume of subordination, which is usually imposed upon women. And we have a costume which is related to dignity and power, which is what men are able to use. So it's not a question of everybody should be allowed to wear everything. In theory, that is the case. The question is whether they are actually imitating those positions in the hierarchy of sex. I think that's the problem, really. Otherwise, of course, as I said in my book, Beauty and Misogyny, if instead of makeup, which is obviously about women's subordination, everybody got to face paint and paint tulips on their forehead, for instance, that would be lovely. And there's no problem with that. We should all do decoration. Lovely, lovely, lovely. The problem is when those practices relate to the hierarchy of power and men's power and the subordination of women. But it is complicated, I agree. How do we ensure that people are allowed to wear what they like without being discriminated against, but also make it socially unacceptable to imitate the subordination of women for excitement? But yes, there is a problem there that we need to talk through. I think that's right.